Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Today, inshallah, we're going to be talking about the 22nd hadith from Al-Arba'in Nawawiyya. And I'm going to read the hadith, and we're going to start reading the hadith, inshallah, and then explain the hadith, and we're going to talk about some different things that relate to the hadith. Number one, عن أبي عبد الله جابر عن أبي عبد الله جابر بن عبد الله الأنصاري رضي الله عنه أن رجلا سأل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال أرأيت إذا صليت المكتوبات وصمت رمضان وأحللت الحلال وحرمت الحرام ولم أزد على ذلك شيئا أأدخل الجنة؟ قال نعم. رواه مسلم. Now, when we look at this hadith, there are actually a number of different issues that we need to talk about. عن أبي عبد الله جابر ibn Abdullah. So the Sahabi Jabir ibn Abdullah. Now, the Sahabi Jabir ibn Abdullah was one of the most important Sahaba that actually narrated a lot of hadith. He was born 16 before Hijrah. So when the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina, he was almost 16 years old. And so basically a younger man. And Jabir ibn Abdullah is from the Ansar. So he's from the Sahaba that were from the Ansar, meaning the Sahaba that were from the residents of Medina. And he used to actually narrate a lot of hadith. He became, of course, Muslim. He's from Al-Khazraj, from the tribe of Al-Khazraj. Now his own father had a lot of daughters. He had 9 daughters, which is one reason why his father did not allow him to participate in the battles, and the battle of Badr and the battle of Uhud as well, because his father had 9 daughters. He didn't want to have his own child, his own son, getting killed, and him getting killed, that is the father, and nobody being there to take care of the daughters. Now, Jabir ibn Abdullah was actually present in Bay'at al-Radwan. Bay'at al-Radwan is basically the meeting, the first meeting that the Sahaba that were from Medina had done before the Prophet ﷺ had migrated. That was a different event. I confused it. Sorry. As she was turning off the some kind of a dehumidifier, I lost my notes. All right. Bay'at al-Radwan, Jabir ibn Abdullah was present during Bay'at al-Radwan. Bay'at al-Radwan, sorry, I confused it with Bay'at al-Aqaba. Bay'at al-Radwan was basically the Bay'ah after al-Hudaybiyah, or during al-Hudaybiyah, during the time of al-Hudaybiyah. The Prophet ﷺ did actually visit Jabir ibn Abdullah when he was ill. And in fact, Jabir ibn Abdullah was the person famous for the story that the Prophet ﷺ actually asked him whether he had gotten married or not. And Jabir ibn Abdullah was in a hurry to go home after the battle. So the Prophet ﷺ then asked him, when he was telling him, like, what are you in a hurry for? He's like, oh, I got married. He's, in other words, excited to go back to his wife. But the Prophet ﷺ asked him who he had gotten married to, and he said, that basically clarified that it wasn't a young woman, and she was not a virgin. So the Prophet ﷺ then tells him, why didn't you get married to a younger woman? In other words, a virgin, a woman that doesn't have a marriage experience before. And he responded, well, it's because he has younger sisters that he wanted another woman to replace a mother figure, to be there as a mother figure for them, and to be there as their mentor to help them as they grow, and to be there in replacement for their loss of not having the mother and the father available. And the Prophet ﷺ actually made the dua for him for the barakah. The Jabir ibn Abdullah did actually participate in the battles after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and Jabir ibn Abdullah later, of course, died in 73-year Hijrah. There are actually differences of opinions. Is it 73? Is it 74? Is it 78? Is it 77-year Hijrah? So generally speaking, it's within that area. He was 94 years old. But one thing is that he lost his sight when he got older. And the one to pray Salat al-Janazah on Jabir ibn Abdullah is basically Aban ibn Uthman. Aban ibn Uthman, and he was the minister or the leader of Medina at the time. And he had actually made a will that Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi would not be the person to make Salat al-Janazah on him. To make the story short, of course, Jabir ibn Abdullah was one of those Sahaba that were present at different times during the times of the Prophet ﷺ. He was definitely mature enough to understand all the different details about the Prophet ﷺ, and he himself actually conducted the different halaqas in the masjid after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, teaching Islam there. Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, so he said, أن رجلا سأل that a man came to ask. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ to ask. So there was one man. Now it's very important to mention here that the word أن رجلا سأل, meaning that there was a man that came. The man wasn't identified, but there are some other scholars that were able to get other narrations to clarify who that man was, but it doesn't make a big difference. The man is Nu'man ibn Qawqal, not Google. Qawqal. Nu'man ibn Qawqal. Nu'man ibn Qawqal was the person that asked the question, and أن رجلا سأل النبي. So the man, I'm just going to first read the hadith, or not read, but translate the hadith in general. So that the man asked, أرأيت إذا صليت المكتوبات. He says, you see, what if, this is putting more of a hypothetical question. What if I would pray the maktubat? Maktubat means the obligatory prayers. And I fasted Ramadan. And I had considered or regarded what is halal as halal and what is haram as haram. And I didn't increase anything to them. I didn't increase anything more than what was required. أدخل الجنة. Will I enter Jannah? So this is just a typo. قال نعم. The Prophet ﷺ says yes. This hadith is narrated by Muslim, which tells you that this hadith is actually an authentic hadith. So there are a number of things here, is that when we look at أرأيت إذا صليت المكتوبات. So here he is, he's coming to the Prophet ﷺ asking a simple question. Simple question is, well, what if I pray my obligatory prayers? In other words, I don't add anything else. Now, this was actually a scenario that happened a number of times where there were other Sahaba that narrated, like there's a hadith in Sahihain. Sahihain means Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim, that an A'rabi came. Now in A'rabi, when we say the word A'rabi, that basically means the Bedouins, what in our times today where they're known as the Bedouins. Now the Bedouins, they're because they're pretty much away from the city, their social skills are extremely low. Their social skills are extremely primitive, and that's why when they come to ask the Prophet ﷺ or even deal with the people in the city, they're usually very vulgar. They're usually very rude in the way they ask questions, etc., which is very common. When we actually hear a hadith saying that there was an A'rabi that was coming in, you're going to right away pre-assume that this is a person that has zero social skills, zero manners in asking questions or even approaching others in dealing with them. They're more of people that have dealt with animals than dealt with people. So this man comes to the Prophet ﷺ. The hadith is narrated in Sahih in both Bukhari and Muslim, and he says, "دلني على عمل إذا عملته دخلت الجنة." Tell me any type of an action that if I do it, it will just let me go into the Jannah. Just an action. And the Prophet ﷺ says, تعبد الله ولا تشرك به شيئا وتقيم الصلاة المكتوبة. So the Prophet ﷺ responds that you would worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not associate any partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and وتقيم الصلاة المكتوبة, and that you would observe the obligatory or required prayers. وتؤدي الزكاة المفروضة, and you would perform zakat al-mafruda, meaning the obligatory amount of zakat. Now, the obligatory amount of zakat is different than donation, because zakat is there's a certain rule for it. There's a certain number for it. There's a certain amount to give. Yes, you can increase your amount of how much you want to donate, but zakat actually has a whole different requirements or different prerequisites that are in zakat compared to the donations, just the general donations. And he also said, وَتَصُومَ Ramadan, and you would fast Ramadan. And the way he responds, again, this is an Arabi, so he just says, وَالَّذِي بَعَثَكَ بِالْحَقِّ لَا أَزِيدُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ عَلَى هَذَا شَيْئًا. He said, by the one that sent you with the truth, I will not increase anything to what you have just said. وَلَا أَنْقُصُ مِنْهُ, meaning I'm not going to eat or decrease. In other words, I'm just going to do what you just said. I'm not going to increase, and I'm not going to decrease anything. فَلَمَّا وَلِيَ, when he left, the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever wants to see a man from Jannah, look at that man. You will see that man. Now, in another narration, it's also in the Sahihain, it seems like it's another Arab. It seems like it's another one of those Arab that we just mentioned. And he actually said, very similar things. And he said, أخبرني ماذا فرض الله علي من الصلاة. He said a very simple question. He says, tell me what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated me from in terms of prayers. So the Prophet ﷺ responds, الصلوات الخمس إلا أن تطوع. He said the 5 daily prayers, and then he added إلا أن تطوع. So he said, the basic and a simple answer to your question is that you're going to pray 5 times unless you want to tatawwa. Tatawwa would mean you're going to do extras, you're going to increase. فقال أخبرني بما فرض الله علي من الصيام. He said, well, tell me what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated from Siyam. So he responds, the Prophet ﷺ, شهر رمضان إلا أن تطوع. Then again he said, fasting the month of Ramadan, unless you would like to increase and you would like to add more fasting. So then he responds, أخبرني بما فرض الله علي من الزكاة. Tell me what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had obligated from zakah. The Prophet ﷺ actually told him بشرائع Islam, told him what Islam says about that. And then he responds, والذي أكرمك بالحق لا أتطوع شيئا ولا أنقص مما فرض الله علي شيئا. فقال الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم أفلح إن صدق أو دخل الجنة إن صدق. So in the hadith, then he says, I'm not going to increase or decrease anything from what you have just mentioned. So the Prophet ﷺ actually says, أفلح إن صدق, that he would be successful, he will succeed if, in other words, in صدق, if he is true and lives up to what he just said. In another narration in Bukhari, that he says, دخل الجنة إن صدق, he would enter Jannah if صدق. صدق, the word صدق would, in a simple literary translation, in صدق would mean if he was honest, or if he's honest. But in another interpretation, it would actually mean if he lives up to what he just put upon himself, which is that he will just do those those main 5 pillars. Now, when we look at this hadith, it's really important to look at the different sides to it, because this part of the hadith can sometimes be confusing for many, which is this part in where he just says, at least in this story, that the Sahabi says, I'm just going to pray. If I would pray 5 daily prayers, and I would just fast, and I would do what is halal and abstain from what is haram, and then I did not add anything, does that qualify me to enter Jannah? And the Prophet ﷺ responds, Na'am. So this Na'am actually brought in some confusion, or at least a misunderstanding in where sometimes people might think, well, here it is, I've got this hadith. Well, there are actually a number of different responses to it. Number one is that the hadith, you don't just take one hadith and forget the rest. And the other part is that you could see that the other narrations that we had just mentioned, which are also narrated by Sahihain, which are also narrated by Bukhari and Muslim, actually add more than what was mentioned here. They added fasting, they added zakah, and they also added hajj. But here it doesn't add hajj. It doesn't add hajj, and it certainly did not add zakah. So that is where other scholars said, well, here ahlaltul halal, haramtul haram is pretty much a vague term that is capable of including what the other hadith included. Now, a very important thing is that when we look at ahlaltul halal and haramtul haram, there are a number of different things to say here, which is, how do we understand ahlaltul halal, haramtul haram? So how do we understand that one would regard something as halal? Is it just an issue of regarding it halal, or is it putting it into an action? Now, a number of things here is that ahlaltul halal, haramtul haram, there's one side of those sides that we're going to discuss, which is the issue of the actual ruling. In other words, we're talking about the actual ruling. We're talking about the understanding of the ruling. Now, there are actually a number of different texts that talked about the people's approach to looking at the text. The first approach is that الذين آتيناهم الكتاب يتلونه حق تلاوته أولئك يؤمنون به. The first approach in where they يتلونه حق تلاوته, they would recite it the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the words. أولئك يؤمنون به. Those are the people that actually believe in it. In other words, they read the words, they interpret the words. So we're talking about the interpretation, we're talking about the recitation is exactly how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had recited and read or revealed the words. The other one, which is that yes, they will look at the revealed words, but they will reinterpret the words to mean a different thing. And there could be many reasons to why some of them would do that. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually told us about the Yahud and how the Yahud were reinterpreting the words to match probably the culture, to match their actions, to suit a situation that they are in. In other words, rechanging the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us about the Yahud and how they were changing the times and the months of certain rituals just in order to get to a certain practice to be in a certain way at certain times. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said in Surah At-Tawbah, إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ يُضَلُّ بِهِ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا يُحِلُّونَهُ عَامًا وَيُحَرِّمُونَهُ عَامًا لِيُوَاطِئُوا عِدَّةَ مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ فَيُحِلُّوا مَا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ. and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said about them that إِنَّمَا النَّسِيءُ زِيَادَةٌ فِي الْكُفْرِ, that it is actually an increase in kufr. Why? Because they were changing the months, they were changing the periods of the months in order to do certain practices, and in the end is that to make it seem more time friendly based on what they wanted to do. It's very similar to what they were doing when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid that they would hunt for hunt the whales or hunt the fish on Saturdays. Very similar to it, and which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually told us the story, which is reinterpreting the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is done in our times in very many different ways. The times that we're living in where using different vague or different, I would say, general texts in Islam, and actually making it as that place to support a lot of the different wrong interpretations in Islam. Let's give an example. Where somebody might say, well, hijab is not obligatory, and my evidence is that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the women were obligated to wear hijab because of the harm that they were getting from the munafiqeen, or from the Bani Israel, or the Yahud at the time. Now, this is an interpretation that is totally far from what the words were actually revealed for, in where the ayat had actually shown that the words actually included Nisa al-Mu'mineen, it included the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, it included the daughters, and it included not necessarily that if the harm is not there, that okay, well, it's okay for you to take it off. Now, there's so many different objections to this interpretation, but I just wanted to note that this is just one of those examples. The other way of how people might approach the text is that they will actually totally flip, in other words, totally change what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so we're talking about the third approach here, totally change what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal and say that it's haram. And in other words, they know the ruling, but they still decide to not apply it. And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تُحَرِّمُوا طَيِّبَاتِ مَا أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. And this would actually talk about two different sides. So in this category, we're talking about one side that might actually transgress the limit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had assigned and actually do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid. The other side is they're aware of something being halal, but they decided to take a further step. It could be under many different pretenses. Pretense number one, that they wanted to be extra cautious. That's pretense number one. Pretense number two, that they actually want to increase in their worship, in their ritual, in the way they approach religiosity. Now that is fanaticism in Islam. Let's do it again. The first approach, all right? The first approach is if the person would regard, well, I wanted to just be careful. In other words, if this is halal, all right, and it seems like, well, this is something that is pertaining to me, and I'd like to take a step back, because many times I often find myself that it's taken me somewhere else. Yes, it's halal, I'm not saying it's haram, but I'd like to take a special stance for myself. This is taqwa, all right? This is taqwa. So for example, let's give an example. Somebody says, hey, you want to go to this restaurant? And you would say, well, yes, I would like to go, and you know it's not haram. But let's say the sister knew that there is one of the waiters that she just couldn't keep her eyes off of. In that situation, she said, well, you know, I'm not interested right now. I actually have lots of studying to do. Even though it wasn't necessarily that is keeping her away from going to that particular restaurant. It is another stance, which is that she was afraid that she will go into the fitna of actually going and seeing, for example, that that man or who knows what. All right. Now, in that situation, this is taqwa, even though going to the restaurant is actually halal. But she wanted to increase taqwa by staying away from what might put her in fitna. This is a simple example. Now, the other type, which is the fanaticism type, the fanaticism one is different because you know the limits. You know the limits, but you want it to increase. You want it to increase in the limit. You want it to increase and actually apply it as if it is haram. So something is halal, but you wanted to apply it as if it's haram, and you regarded it so. Now this is actually haram. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تُحَرِّمُوا طَيِّبَاتِ مَا أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. Do not regard what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as halal, regard it as haram. If وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا, and do not commit a transgression. الْإِعْتِدَاء, which is transgression, is pretty much a form. It's a form of transgressing the limits on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and al-i'tida is a form of an offense. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling us that going off the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a form of offense on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in where you are putting yourself in a position to legislate instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're putting your opinion at a higher level and above Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's legislature. Now, a number of other things to mention is that even when it comes to haram, there are different levels of haram, just like there are different levels of halal. There are different levels of halal and different levels of haram. Different levels of haram, there is the fard. And different scholars on whether the word fard and wajib actually mean the same thing or not. There's the second level, which is the sunnah, in where the fard or the wajib, if you leave the fard or the wajib, then you're actually held accountable. In other words, you're at sin for leaving it. The sunnah, on the other hand, you're not at sin for leaving it. You're not at sin for leaving it, but you will be rewarded for doing it. Now, there's the other part, which is the halal. Now, the halal would mean that it is left for you to decide on whether you would like to do it or not. In other words, it's an option that is left for you to determine on whether you want to approach or not, as it's permissible to take whatever stance. Now, the other part, which is the haram. Now, haram is at different levels. There's the haram to mean that you're supposed to abstain, but even the haram, that's at different levels. There's the kaba'ir, there's the kabira, which is the major sin, and there's the saghira, which is the minor sin. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Well, in general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن تَجْتَنِبُوا كَبَائِرَ مَا تُنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ نُكَفِّرْ عَنْكُمْ سَيِّئَاتِكُمْ وَنُدْخِلْكُمْ مُدْخَلًا كَرِيمًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِن تَجْتَنِبُوا. Now, one thing is that if we look at that ayah, إِن تَجْتَنِبُوا, the word تَجْتَنِبُوا is actually hinting to us that when it comes to, when it comes to recognizing the different sides around us, that there is more than just abstaining, meaning not doing an action, because there is the level of even leaving the area of and the environment of that haram side, which is how you're going to relate to kaba'ir. The major sins, even the environment, even the people. And this is really important to mention, because remember the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ actually says that there are 3 different levels of doing what is amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. The first one is that you're supposed to be doing it with your hand. And then the second level, which is the second level and doing it orally, and you're giving it an oral advice. And the third level, which is the level with your heart. Remember that one? Well, the one with the heart, for example, that's the least. Well, that would actually mean that you're abstaining even from the people that do it, because your heart, if you didn't have the power to change that with your authority, in the second level with your oral advice, etc., admonishment, whatever it is necessarily to keep that society away from such behavior. The third one, which is even disliking, but it's not just an issue of disliking, but you're actually disassociating yourself even from that action. In other words, you're disassociating yourself even from the people that do that action, because in the end is that you don't want anything to do with that particular transgression. So when we look at tajtanibu, this is exactly what we're talking about, where we're talking about al-kaba'ir, in where you're actually doing ijtinab. Ijtinab is even farther than just simply not doing. It is even sorry about that. It is even isolating yourself away from this area, because it's a kabira. This is not any just a small sin. Now, when we're looking at kaba'ir, we're actually talking about major sins. Now, scholars had differences of opinions on, are the major sins necessarily the 7, which is 1, associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 2, killing, 3, disrespecting parents, 4, riba, which is interest, and 5, stealing, or actually witnessing, being a false witness, in other words, which is shahadat az-zur, and drinking alcohol, and of course zina. Now, scholars had different opinions on whether that is limited to those, whether the major sins are limited to those, or whether it is actually more than those 4. Now, a number of things to say is that when we're looking at kaba'ir, remember that it says ijtinab. Now, it's really important to keep in mind, one of the most important things that I think is really necessary to learn is really the science of usul al-fiqh. What is usul al-fiqh? It's the science of principles of fiqh. Meaning what? It basically teaches you, and it takes you into the epistemology, what takes us, and what is the foundation that we go back to as Muslims in order to help us identify our resources of information. In other words, our resources of understanding the principles of ethics, and understanding when it comes to morality, when it comes to action, what is considered as a considerable resource for us to go back to in order to define something right and wrong. And that's exactly what usul al-fiqh studies. Now, when we look at usul al-fiqh, it's not just studying the resource. Okay, I know I need to go back to Quran and Sunnah, and that's it. But no, it's also learning how to understand the words of the Quran and the Hadith, and actually derive what is the lesson learned. The lesson learned that you should approach, not approach, and the level of mandation or the level of prohibition. How severe is that to abstain from it or to actually do? And here the word tajtanibu is actually telling you that the most severe type of approach. In other words, you're approaching it in a way where you are totally disassociating yourself from that kabira, from those major sins. And that's the word ijtinab, which is exactly the same word exactly the same word when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually talked about zina, and it talked about it, and that do not even approach zina, do not even ijtinab. The word that is used is ijtinab, in where totally separate yourself, meaning probably the sight things, maybe if it's a sight, maybe if it's seeing, don't look at things that relate to haram. Don't even listen to things, maybe the novels that have haram things. Don't even read those kind of novels. Don't even associate with the area that might actually enhance your lust to that area. So when we're looking at an ijtinab, It's a higher level in where you're totally disassociating yourself and totally separating your heart from that area. Now, the other part, which is that ma'asiyah, when we're talking about the ma'asiyah, we're looking at the haram in where we're talking about the saghira. Now, saghira, it doesn't mean that it's not haram. The saghira would mean that, and it doesn't mean that there's no punishment for it, but a saghira would mean that it's haram, but there was no punishment that at least we know of that was assigned. We don't know of a punishment that was assigned when we look at halal, kabira, there was an actual assignment. There was a punishment that was mentioned. Take, for example, zina. There was an assignment. There was a hadith that actually talked about what the punishment is going to look like. There was a hadith that talked about a punishment, and what the punishment is if a person is married, if a person is not married, or had a marriage experience, and what it looks like. Now, all these different sides are basically telling us that the levels of haram are number one is that there's actually a nas, there's actually a text to tell me that such a matter is haram. Number two, so there's a nas, it's telling me that it's haram. Sorry about that. There's actually, but sometimes here we go. There's actually a text that's telling me it's haram, and the other one is basically the level 2. Let me erase that. So there's one. Oops. Okay, now one, there's telling me a text. Number 2 is that there's actually a nas, there's actually a text, but it's not necessarily putting a punishment there. All right, but the text is also the text is also not telling me not of a punishment only, but it doesn't actually give me a specific punishment in this dunya or in the akhirah. Because if it does give a punishment, that would make it into a kabira. Meaning it's a major sin. The other kind, which is dhamm al-fa'al. Dhamm al-fa'al would mean that it's basically saying that this action is not right. This action, that person that does such an action is not good. So now this is dhamm al-fa'al. This is telling me about that the action itself is telling me about the person or the action itself, that it's disliked. That the Prophet ﷺ disliked it, and the Prophet ﷺ had told us in a number of hadith that this action is not good. Just telling us that it's not good. Now this would also be a saghira. Let's give an example. The Prophet ﷺ, when he approached, he was seeing a man who was eating with his left hand. All right. So he saw the man eating with his left hand, and then the Prophet ﷺ told him to eat with his right hand. But the guy said, I can't. So the Prophet ﷺ told him to eat with his right hand, but the man just said, oh, I can't, and the way that he rejected was somewhat of a way that was not even putting an effort, 2, that it was disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Mustatat, it's like, me not be able to do it. And then the man never was able to lift his arm up again, at least the left arm up again, with the right arm, to be able to eat with it ever again. In other words, he was never able to even have the effort and the ability to do it. Now here, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether did the man lose his ability to, in other words, it was a punishment really. Did the man lose the ability to eat again with that hand, which is the right hand, mustatat, in other words, may never be able to do it? Did he lose the ability because he was disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ, or is it that because he didn't put the effort, or is it because he just rejected an obligation? Is that an obligation, or was that revealing that the Prophet ﷺ hated it? Now, here, scholars had differences of opinions on, this is just an example, on whether eating with your left hand is a saghira or whether it's a kabira, whether it's a major sin or whether it's a minor sin, because of the story that we had mentioned. Because it's basically talking about that action. So is, for example, when we're looking at here, eating with your left hand, is it haram, or is it makruh, or is it that you should just not do it because it's in between haram and makruh? It's in between those areas. Now, when we're looking at the different ahadith, the different nusus, the different texts that would indicate that such an action is to be considered as and regarded as not acceptable, is that, number one, is that there would be a clear text that's saying that this is forbidden. A clear text that's saying do not do, actually ordering you to abstain. Or three, a text that's telling you that there was a punishment for their action. In other words, the person is held accountable, there's a punishment, whether in this dunya or in the akhirah. Number four, which is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised, in other words, had threatened that there would be some kind of a punishment to it. Just like, for example, when we're talking about not wear hijab, where the Prophet ﷺ, the hadith is clear, where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that there will be women close to Judgment Day, close to the time of Judgment Day, at the end of times, that is, where they will be dressed yet naked. And the Prophet ﷺ said, and they would not smell the smell of Jannah. So this is actually telling us that not wearing hijab, as an example, is actually a major sin and not a minor sin. Why? Because the hadith indicated that there is an actual adab, that there was an actual punishment where they will be distant from Jannah, Now the other part which I didn't discuss yet, which is Sallaytul Maktubat. So what is Sallaytul Maktubat? Sallaytul Maktubat would basically mean Maktubat. Sallayt is Salah. Now the word Salah just means dua, but here just means an invocation. But here, and in all the Muslim texts, when we're talking about Salah, it is specifically talking about the 5 obligatory prayers. This is the Salah, the 5 obligatory prayers. Al-Maktubat would mean that they are decreed, they're required, they are obligatory. Al-Maktubat, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says that is Salah, that inna salata kanat al mu'minina kitaban mawquta, that Salah was prescribed on the believers, kitaban mawquta. It is prescribed, and there's a specific time for it. And this is really important. You could do a certain action, it could be a good deed, but just because you happen to do it at the wrong time, it could be a bad deed. What does that mean? Let's say you prayed Dhuhr at the time of Salat al-Asr. You might say, well, I'm doing something good, I'm praying, right? Well, not doing it at the right time actually makes it opposite. Unless you forgot, that's a different story, right? Unless you forgot, unless you had a reason and you needed to make it up, that's a different story. But there is kitaban mawquta, doing the things, even if they're mandatory, even if they're good things, doing it on time is as good as doing the actual good thing. Il-Maktubat, so Salah. Now, generally speaking, Salah is obligatory. We know it's one of the 5 pillars. And of course, scholars had differences of opinions on whether if somebody does not pray, on whether they are considered kafir or not. And the reason why they had differences of opinions is because of one hadith in At-Tirmidhi where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, Al-ahdu baynana wa baynahum tarku salah. That the difference, al-ahd is like the covenant. The covenant between us and bainahum, speaking about the non-believers or the disbelievers, is leaving salah. In other words, the difference between a believer and a disbeliever is really salah. And that had a number of different interpretations on whether, one, are these people leaving salah purposely, or are they just being lazy to leaving salah? This is one opinion. The second opinion is that no, if you don't do your salah, that would actually mean that you are not Muslim, period. They're not Muslim, period, and therefore you would not be buried in a Muslim graveyard. You're not even Muslim. Your wife would be divorced from you because you don't do salah. In other words, we're not talking about missing one prayer, but we're talking about regular. Your wife would be divorced from you because if you're calling that man kafir, that would simply mean a Muslim woman can't be married to a kafir. So therefore, even the wife would be not married to this man anymore. The third opinion is that no, the person is not kafir, but the person is held accountable. The person's going to be held accountable on Judgment Day for leaving salah. And this is the preponderant ruling, is that the person, al-ahdu baynana wa baynahum tarku salah, is not that the person is kafir, but that the person, their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very similar to the connection of a kafir with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in where it's not even there. It's not even there. So again, three differences of opinions. Just wanted to note that because this is very common. This is a very common question in where sisters are approaching and they're like, oh, my husband doesn't pray. I'm not really sure. Am I still his wife or not? And just wanted to make sure that we understand asl al-mas'ala. We understand what is the foundation. What brought this discussion even between the scholars? Why did they have differences of opinions on this matter? Now the other part, which is sumtu Ramadan. Sumtu, the word sumtu takes us back to what Sayyidah Maryam actually said. And then in what Sayyidah Maryam actually says, Inni nadartu lirrahmani sawma. She said, nadartu lirrahmani sawma. She made an oath to actually do sawm. And the word sawm actually means to abstain. It literally means to abstain, but sumtu Ramadan would actually clarify to us that this is not abstaining from bad habits, or abstaining from not speaking, or abstaining from probably doing certain things, but it is actually literally making and practicing the abstaining from eating, drinking, and sexual relations from specific times to a specific time, from dawn, or from that time at least dawn, close to dawn, until sunset. This is speaking about practicing in a specific way. In other words, when we speak about practicing a ritual, we have to go back to the Prophet ﷺ to explain to us how we practice that ritual, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually says, خُذُوا عَنِّي مَنَاسِكَكُمْ, take the manasik. The manasik are not only, the manasik can be limited to Hajj, and can also be in general in where وَمَا أَتَكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. What the Prophet ﷺ had come to teach you, to tell us, مَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ, what he came with, and what he had come with, everything, فَخُذُوهُ, then take it. Because that would be your, again, remember the word usul al-fiqh, that would be your source, your resource for your epistemological understanding of ethics, morality, all the different things that surround you. You're going to go back to the Prophet ﷺ, and here we look at it. Sumtu Ramadan is explaining that this is not talking about some sort of a personal abstinence, but this is speaking about a type of a ritual that one would fast during Ramadan, as the Prophet ﷺ had fasted during Ramadan. You might say, well, we all know this, but unfortunately we're living in a time where the ABCs of a lot of the Islamic knowledge, just, I'll tell you one thing, just a little story. When I was studying my undergrad, and especially my undergrad, I was always confused why our teachers would teach us usul al-fiqh. It's like, I knew that. What else is new? So what? That was easy. But it isn't until I went into my master's when I realized that there were there and that was many years ago. So that was in 2003. Right now we're 2020. So we're looking at a number of years. And it wasn't it that in 2003, that's when I started noticing that there was an agenda that was coming that was coming towards the Muslim community, towards the Muslim Ummah internationally, to reinterpret the religion. And I had proposed that to the professors, and I said, here's the agenda, and this is what the think tanks are doing, that this is coming our way. My professors at the time said they're not going to be able to. No, the Muslims in the West might actually be manipulated to believing those interpretations, but not the Muslims in the East. Well, they were totally wrong. The Muslims in both the East and the West, just because right now we're looking at the foundations of Islamic academia and learning Islam, are right now gone. Right now we're seeing all those misinterpretations rampant. It is becoming so common that we're seeing Muslims actually making their own interpretation as if they were qualified to actually give fatwa. So right now when we talk about Sultan Ramadan, so excuse me if you already know this, but it's really important to get to the usul. And I'm actually thinking of making an usul al-fiqh course in the coming months, inshallah. But inshallah we'll be doing that. Ahlaltul halal. And here, ahlaltul halal, meaning that I regarded. Ahlaltu would mean that I regarded what is halal as halal. What is halal as halal. But does it mean that ahlaltul halal only regarding halal? Well, ahlaltul halal would actually go and include the wajib, would include what is wajib or fard. This is the word wajib and fard. I mentioned that before. Scholars had differences of opinions in the classification. They didn't have differences of opinions on whether salah is a fard or not, but they had differences of opinions on defining what is a fard and defining what is wajib. So for the Hanafi madhab, they will say wajib, for example, salat al-witr. They will regard salat al-witr as wajib. But for the majority, they will regard it as, no, it's a sunnah. And it's not that they're disagreeing on whether the Prophet ﷺ encouraged doing it or not, but they had disagreed on the level of mandation. Now, one thing is that when we talk about regarding something as halal, so regarding something as halal actually means that you're also taking the different stance, that if something is obligatory, you're actually implementing it. If something is halal, well, you're regarding it as halal, in other words, regarding it as so, and not being fanatic and saying that it's haram. Now, لا تحرموا طيبات ما أحل الله لكم ولا تعتدوا is actually telling us about that fanaticism, that those that will actually say that something is halal and regard it as haram as a form and thinking that it's going to make the community better. This is in response to that. Now, there are different levels of regarding that when we're talking about regarding halal as haram. Number one is if somebody believes that something that is actually halal and believed that it is haram, then in that situation, they had actually committed something that is kufr. All right? But I don't want you to go into takfiri right here and hurrying, because what if something has differences of opinions between scholars? If something has differences of opinions between scholars, that's a different story. We're talking about something that is blatantly, clearly mentioned in the Quran to be in halal or etc. All right, that would be kufr to regard something as halal, that is halal, as haram and otherwise. Now the other part, which is if the person, they actually did an oath. All right, what is that? So oath is actually two different kinds. The first kind is called yamin. The second kind is called nadhr. There's a difference between nadhr and yameen, in where for yameen, you are mainly, most of the times, is actually talking about the past. Wallahi, I did such and such. Wallahi, most of the times it's talking about the past. Wallahi, but both of them are associating the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with them. In nadhr, in the other hand, is more speaking about future, in where you're making an oath to actually do something in the future. It doesn't necessarily have to be the oath al-mu'allaq. Al-oath al-mu'allaq, which is that, for example, you're making an oath and you are saying, if such and such happens, I will do such and such. For example, if my son is cured from cancer, I will build a well in Africa, for example. This is an oath in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that this oath, this type of oath, in English they're both called oath. In Arabic there's a difference. They're both called oath, and the Prophet ﷺ disliked that type of oath that is and the Prophet ﷺ actually said لا يستخرج إلا من البخيل, that it is only taken from somebody that is bakhil, like greedy, in where they don't want to donate unless they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving them a blessing first. This is somebody that is selfish, somebody that is bakhil, somebody that is cheap in the way that they donate, in where they want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them a blessing first before they even do that. Now, another doesn't have to be based on getting a blessing first in order to happen. But it can be that you just said, every single day, I'm going to do this nadhr, I'm going to do this, in where, by Allah, I will every single day memorize 10 lines in the Quran. So here you are, you said that by Allah, I'm going to memorize. What did you do? You actually made Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be the witness, and you made an agreement between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is nadhr. Where the Prophet ﷺ, or actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and praise those yufuna bin nadhr wa khafuna yawman kana sharruhu mustatira. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually praised the mu'mineen that yufuna bin nadhr, that they apply, that they implement the oaths that they had committed themselves with. In other words, that they had forced or obliged themselves with, they obligated themselves with, and in that situation, that becomes obligatory on them. You made this oath, you put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your witness, you have to apply it. You put it, and here, nadhr is not to be put in your heart. It's not that, oh, every single day, you're not doing it in your heart, but you're literally saying it. The oath can only be said, all right? The oath can only be said. In other words, orally said. It's not something that in your heart you made an intention that, oh, every single day from now on, I'm going to put an effort to memorize 10 lines of Quran every day. If that was just an intention that you put in your heart, this is not included. I don't want, a whole bunch of phone calls storming at me. Oh, I promised myself one day, 20 years ago, that I will do this and I never did it. Do I pay the kafara or not? Or give the expiation or not? Okay, so just make sure that it's about saying. All right, now in that situation, this becomes obligatory. Now, the other part of Ahlaltul Halal or Haramtul Haram, in where you actually abstained from certain actions, and without an oath, whether yameen or nadhr, but you were like, I'm not going to do this. It's not necessarily that you had committed a sin, but unless you're being fanatic about it, all right, but you just decided that I'd like to not approach. Now, the other part is that when we're talking about haram, we're talking about two sides. We're talking about the side in where how your stance is. In other words, what do you believe? The haramtul haram, meaning that you regard that as haram, all right? But to actually regard something that is haram as halal is kufr. Why is it kufr? You got yourself out of the fold of Islam because you regarded you regarded something other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has regarded. In other words, you put yourself on top of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's legislature. All right. Now the other part, which is the other part, haramtul haram, would also mean implementation. In other words, not only do you consider something as haram, but you also not do it. In other words, you actually abstain from doing that haram. You abstain from doing it. Now, one side is that what if the person actually does the haram? In other words, they believed that it was haram, but they still did it. In that sense, then the person is held accountable. Then they had committed something that is haram. But if they don't believe, let's do it again. So if they believe that it was haram, but they still did it, in other words, they still did it, then that action would make them held accountable. But if they believed that something is halal, even though it's haram, that would get them out of the fold of Islam. All right, now we're actually getting to the end right here. وَلَمْ أَزِدْ عَلَى ذَلِكَ شَيْئًا. Let me comment on that one. وَلَمْ أَزِدْ عَلَى ذَلِكَ شَيْئًا. We mentioned that one in the beginning, in where the Prophet ﷺ, when the man said, I'm not going to increase anything, we mentioned that the scholars actually said that this is including أزد على ذلك شيئا, including the actions in where you're doing what is halal and you're abstaining from what is haram, which includes zakah and hajj, as mentioned in the other hadith. So now the other part is that when we're talking about adkhulul Jannah, there are actually two different levels of entering Jannah. Okay, there's the level of entering Jannah, which is dukhul awwali, meaning it's where you're entering Jannah and you were never punished. That's dukhul awwali. But there's the other one, which is dukhul ma'ali, meaning that eventually you're entered Jannah, but that is after going into the stages of punishment in hellfire. So when we're talking about entering Jannah, two different levels. Now the other part is that when we're talking about the different meanings of that we actually see in these, in where does it really mean that if somebody prays and they would fast Ramadan, but they don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all right? No, this is meaning that this is after that the person had submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in La ilaha illallah. So if a person that is not Muslim and says, well, I'm going to pray and I'm going to fast Ramadan and I'm going to live as a Muslim, but I still believe, let's say the person said that they still believe that Jesus, peace be upon him, is the Son of God, for example. In that situation, that gets them out of the fold of Tawheed and eventually gets them out of that. So Jazakumullah khairan, everybody, and Barakallahu feekum. And let's see, somebody is actually fasting, so they have to go make their iftar right here. MashaAllah, I'm very proud of those that actually wrote me that they're actually fasting. Allah yablan ya Rabbi. So those that get punishment on grave are counted on the first or second group that enter Jannah. So for the punishment in the grave, that's actually different stages, because there's the Prophet ﷺ actually said about the punishment of grave. He actually mentioned that the Dammatul Qabr, where the heart, the heart, not the heart, sorry, but the embracement or that squeeze that you will find. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Rabbi, keep all the different adhab away from us. That the squeeze of the grave, everybody is inevitably going to be feeling that. And the Prophet ﷺ actually says, لَوْ نَجَى مِنْهَا أَحَدْ لَنَجَى مِنْهَا سَعْدٍ. If anybody was going to be protected or saved from it, then Sa'd ibn Mu'adh would have been the first to be saved from it. So when we're talking about punishment in the grave, it depends on what stage we're talking about. All right, so Jazakumullah khairan, everyone. What's the name of the scholar that given the oath to fast to stop backbiting? Did it work? So he changed it to give money, and that worked for him. I don't know the answer to this question, the name of the scholar that gave the oath to fast to stop backbiting and that it didn't work. I don't know. I'll look it up, inshallah. So jazakumullah khairan, everyone, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.